Have you ever been told that the way you speak is wrong, even when everyone understands you perfectly? What if I told you that a voice once laughed at, dismissed as unnatural, would one day rise to become the gold standard of communication in Asia? That's the irony of this story. What the world once rejected, it now embraces. And at the center of this transformation is the Filipino spirit, quiet, humble, but unshakable. When I first heard about Miguel, a quiet boy growing up in Quezon City in the 1970s, I couldn't help but think, his life was like a mirror for an entire nation. Miguel loved words. His mother, a schoolteacher, would hand him old American storybooks and ask him to read out loud. He loved the rhythm of English sentences, the way they danced when spoken with his own Filipino lilt. But school was not always kind. When he recited, his classmates laughed. "You sound funny," they teased. Even teachers corrected him, not because his grammar was wrong, but because his accent wasn't neutral enough. And Miguel's story wasn't unique. For decades, Filipinos were told that their English sounded forced, even comical. Foreigners mocked it. Hollywood made broken English a punchline. Neighbors in Asia sometimes looked down on it. But still, Filipinos kept speaking. In classrooms, offices, marketplaces, churches, English was no longer just the language of books or colonial rulers. It had seeped into life itself. It was part of jokes shared on jeepneys, songs on the radio, and Sunday mass prayers whispered half in English, half in Tagalog. Here lies the twist. The very thing mocked as wrong became the very skill the world could not live without. Filipino English, with its warmth and clarity, quietly became the bridge connecting Asia to the world. Miguel didn't know any of this yet. At 18, he applied for a job at one of the first call centers in Makati. On his very first day, an American consultant came in to correct their accents. "Say the word schedule," the trainer said. Miguel said it as he always had. "Schedule." The trainer frowned. No, that sounds odd. Try schedule." The room fell silent. Miguel felt a knot in his stomach. Was his English really wrong? That night, he stood in front of the mirror, practicing, repeating, twisting his tongue to sound neutral. But the more he imitated, the less himself he became. His words lost rhythm. They lost music. He wondered, why must I sound like someone else to be understood? Isn't clarity enough? Years later, that same company would throw away those old training manuals. Instead of forcing employees to mimic foreign accents, they began celebrating the Filipino voice, calling it clear, approachable, and warm. What once was embarrassment became a brand. Because Miguel's struggle was never just about pronunciation. It was about identity. Every time someone said Filipino English is unnatural, it wasn't just about sound. It was about belonging. About whether Filipinos were allowed to step onto the world stage with their own voice. But English in the Philippines was never just copied. It was transformed. It was bent and blended with Tagalog, Visayan, Ilocano. It became English with color, English with laughter, English with a soul. One evening, Miguel sat in a small cafe in Makati. At the next table, 3 foreigners, a Korean, an Indian, and an American, were talking about the challenges of communication. The American laughed. "Sometimes I can't even understand British English. But Filipinos, Their English is the clearest for me. Miguel froze. His heart skipped. He didn't say a word, but he smiled into his coffee. That single moment, that small affirmation, planted a seed. Maybe Filipino English was never inferior. Maybe it had always been its own strength. And that seed didn't just grow in Miguel. It grew in an entire people. Today, when Japanese students want to learn English, they fly not to New York, but to Manila. Companies in Singapore and Malaysia hire Filipino trainers to teach communication. Even China quietly brings in Filipino educators to coach their young professionals. The accent, once ridiculed, is now exported as Asia's clearest voice. So let me ask you, why is it that something once laughed at as unnatural has become the very standard Asia relies on today? Could it be that what makes Filipino English different, the warmth, the rhythm, the blending of cultures, is exactly what the world had been missing all along? That question lingers with us as we continue the journey, because Miguel's story is far from over, and neither is the story of Filipino English. Miguel's early years in the call center were just the beginning. Slowly, he realized his own personal struggle was part of something much bigger, a cultural battle being fought across an entire nation. Everywhere he looked, young Filipinos were wrestling with the same question: is our English good enough? Or must we always twist our voices to sound like someone else? In the 1990s, as global outsourcing companies began flooding into the Philippines, those doubts only grew louder. Corporations wanted agents who could speak smoothly with Americans, Australians, Europeans. Many executives doubted whether Filipinos could handle it. "Your English sounds too local," one foreign manager bluntly declared in a newspaper interview. Customers might not trust the accent. That single remark echoed like thunder. It was the same wound Miguel had carried as a boy, the sting of being told that your words, your very voice, were somehow not enough. And yet, something unexpected happened. Filipinos didn't just answer phones. They listened. They didn't just read from scripts. They empathized. A woman in Texas might call furious that her internet wasn't working, but by the end of the call, she would be calmer, even grateful. "You were so kind," she'd say. "You made me feel heard." That was the quiet power of Filipino English. It wasn't only about delivering words. It carried warmth. Miguel noticed this one evening during his 3rd year on the job. Sitting beside him was Liza, a single mother from Davao. Her English carried a strong local rhythm, but customers adored her. Curious, Miguel asked her why she thought people responded so positively. She smiled and said, "Because I don't try to sound American. I just try to sound like myself. Customers can tell when you're genuine." Those words struck Miguel like a prayer. For the first time, he realized maybe what outsiders called unnatural was in fact the most natural thing of all. But the road remained difficult. In classrooms across the Philippines, children were still taught that good English meant sounding as close to American or British as possible. A mispronounced V or a rolled R could earn a red mark. Miguel remembered his nephew coming home in tears because a teacher mocked the way he said photograph. "Am I stupid?" the boy whispered. Miguel hugged him tightly. "No, you are not stupid. They just don't understand yet." This generational wound, shame passed from one classroom to the next, planted deep seeds of insecurity. And yet, alongside that pain, something else began to grow. A quiet resilience. Filipinos kept speaking, kept working, kept pushing forward. Slowly, the world began to notice. By the early 2000s, Manila and Cebu had transformed into global outsourcing hubs. Entire skyscrapers buzzed through the night, with thousands of voices connecting Asia to the West. Then came Miguel's turning point. Promoted to team leader, he was once asked to demonstrate a live call for a group of visiting executives from Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia. Nervous but determined, he picked up the phone. On the line was a frustrated customer from Chicago. Miguel spoke calmly, clearly, in his natural Filipino cadence. Within 5 minutes, the customer was laughing. When the call ended, the room of executives erupted in applause. One Japanese manager exclaimed, "That is exactly what we want for our people, to sound like him." Miguel could hardly believe it. The same accent he was once told to suppress was now the model others wanted to follow. That very day, his company signed a new contract, not just to answer calls, but to train foreign teams. For the first time, Filipinos weren't just service providers, they were teachers. Still, outside the office, the battle for acceptance continued. On television, comedians used broken English as a cheap punchline. Politicians mocked rivals' accents for easy laughs. Social media spread jokes about Carabao English. The insecurity ran deep. But something else was happening too. More and more Filipinos abroad, nurses in London, seafarers in the Middle East, engineers in Canada, were proving that their English wasn't a weakness, but a key that opened doors. Employers praised them not only for their skill, but for their ability to connect across cultures. Miguel saw this transformation in his own family. One day, his cousin, a nurse in Saudi Arabia, wrote him a letter. "I thought my English was poor, but here, my patients tell me they understand me better than the British nurses. Can you imagine? They ask me to explain things in English because I make it simpler." Reading those words, Miguel felt tears run down his face. It was as if the world was finally beginning to see what he, Liza, and thousands of others had known all along. Filipino English was not a weakness. It was a gift. By the late 2000s, something unexpected was happening. International universities were no longer just looking to London or New York for English teachers. They were looking to Manila, Cebu, and Davao. In South Korea, parents lined up outside after-school academies, eager to enroll their children in classes taught by Filipinos. In Japan, companies discovered that online conversational tutors from the Philippines were more effective and far more approachable than foreign instructors flown in from the West. And in China, where nationalism ran deep and pride in their own language was strong, parents still quietly paid extra for Filipino teachers. Why? Because their children responded better to the clear, friendly voices that made English less frightening and more human. Pause. Miguel could feel the shift in the air. What had once been a mark of shame was slowly becoming a point of pride. And yet, pride takes time to heal old wounds. Miguel still remembered the sting of being told, "Your English is unnatural." He still remembered the mocking laughs, the red marks in school notebooks, the dismissive corrections. Those scars never fully vanished. But something was changing. Every insult, every laugh, every rejection was being rewritten by millions of conversations. Conversations where Filipino voices soothed, taught, comforted, connected. Evidence was piling up that Filipino English was not just good enough. It was perhaps the most human form of English the world had ever known. And so the question remains, Could it be that what the world once dismissed was always destined to rise? Could it be that the very accent they laughed at contained the warmth, the patience, the adaptability the world had secretly been longing for? Miguel didn't know it yet, but he and his people were standing at the threshold of something even bigger. Filipino English was about to stop being seen as a service and start becoming a standard. Fast forward to 2012. Miguel found himself seated in a grand conference hall in Singapore, surrounded by world leaders, educators, and policymakers. The occasion: a regional summit on education and communication. The subject: the future of language training in Asia. Miguel, once a boy mocked for his accent, was now a guest speaker representing the Philippine call center industry, a sector that had exploded into a global powerhouse. He sat quietly at first, listening as delegates from across the continent shared their insights. Then a representative from South Korea stood up and said words Miguel would never forget. "For decades, we sent our children to America to learn English. But we discovered something unexpected. They were learning faster and with more confidence from Filipino teachers. The warmth and clarity of Filipino English became the model we wanted to follow." The room erupted with nods of agreement. Miguel's hands trembled as he scribbled notes. He remembered the sting of being corrected, of being told again and again that his pronunciation was unnatural. And now, here he was, watching history flip before his very eyes. The same voice once dismissed was now being praised by nations. By the mid-2010s, the transformation was undeniable. The Philippines had become Asia's #1 destination for English training. Japanese retirees flew to Cebu, living in dormitories where their mornings began with adobo and their afternoons with English conversation practice. Korean students filled boarding houses in Baguio, walking narrow streets with notebooks in hand, reciting dialogues with their Filipino mentors. And in China, long after midnight, entrepreneurs secretly logged into online tutoring platforms, speaking to Filipinos in quiet whispers so as not to draw attention. They weren't just practicing English, they were learning how to connect in it. What made Filipino English so magnetic? Miguel asked himself this question often. He knew the answer wasn't grammar or perfect pronunciation. It was something deeper. Filipino English carried patience, because Filipinos knew what it was like to be underestimated. It carried humor, because they had learned to laugh even when life was difficult. It carried humility, because they never spoke just to impress, but always to connect. That combination created something no textbook, no foreign instructor, no rigid training program could ever teach. One memory etched itself into Miguel's heart. He was invited to Osaka, Japan, to visit a school where Filipino teachers were training Japanese children. He entered a classroom expecting nervous silence, the kind of stiff atmosphere common in second-language lessons. But instead, he heard laughter, bright, unrestrained laughter. At the front of the room stood Maricar, a Filipino teacher, acting out a story in English. She used her hands, her face, her smile to bring the words to life. The children giggled, repeated after her, raised their hands eagerly to join in. One boy, perhaps 7 years old, stood up and said proudly, "Teacher, I can say it. I can say it in English." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. The boy's accent carried the same Filipino rhythm that once made Miguel insecure. Yet here, in that Osaka classroom, it was celebrated. It was not a weakness. It was a bridge between two worlds. That night, alone in his hotel room, Miguel whispered to himself, "They once called it unnatural. Now it is the voice of Asia." The irony was almost too sharp to believe. But beneath that irony was something deeper, something more powerful. This was never just about language. It was about dignity. For generations, Filipinos had lived under the shadow of colonial history, taught to believe they were always second best, always imitators, never originators. Filipino English shattered that lie. It was proof that something borrowed could be transformed into something entirely new, something so distinct, so human, that the world itself would one day need it. And the recognition only grew louder. At a business conference in Dubai, Miguel overheard a Saudi executive speaking to his colleagues. "When I hire Filipino staff," the man said, "I know they can handle clients from anywhere. Their English is clear, respectful, and professional." Miguel smiled quietly to himself. For him, for his people, for every Filipino once mocked for their voice, these words were not just compliments. They were vindication. In London, a hospital director once told Miguel something he would never forget. "We prefer Filipino nurses because patients understand them more easily than native English speakers." It wasn't just a compliment. For Miguel, every testimony like that felt like a stone being laid into a foundation of pride, a foundation that had taken years, even generations, to build. But back home, he knew acceptance was slower. In Manila, television hosts still joked about Filipino English bloopers. Elite schools still demanded their students mimic foreign accents, insisting that proper English meant sounding like someone else. Yet outside those circles, in the real world, inside homes, call centers, offices, airports, the truth was impossible to ignore. Filipino English was no longer just one version of English. It was becoming the measure of clarity and empathy across Asia. One evening, Miguel returned to his old neighborhood in Quezon City. He visited the small cafe where, years earlier, he had once overheard foreigners praising Filipino English. But this time, he wasn't alone. He brought his teenage daughter. As they sipped coffee together, she leaned in and said, "Dad, in school today, my teacher told us our accent is something to be proud of. She said the world is learning from us now." Miguel froze. His throat tightened. That single sentence meant more to him than all the conferences, contracts, or awards he had ever received. It was proof that the wound was healing, that his daughter's generation would grow up not apologizing for their voice, but celebrating it. And so, Filipino English stopped being only about work. It became about identity, a declaration. We don't need to sound like anyone else to matter. Our voice, in all its rhythm and warmth, was already enough. But the question lingered. How far could this voice really reach? Could Filipino English, once ridiculed in classrooms, one day influence the way the world communicates? Miguel didn't know the answer. But soon, he would come close. The moment came quietly, almost unexpectedly. He had been invited to speak at a global education forum in Geneva. The hall was filled with representatives from over 50 countries, ministers, professors, industry leaders. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, the old fear returned. What if they laughed at his accent? What if they whispered the same word that haunted him since childhood? Unnatural. He took a deep breath and began. His voice was steady, not polished, not pretending, but warm, human. He spoke of the rise of Filipino English, of how it had become the backbone of Asia's outsourcing industry, of how millions of students in Japan, South Korea, and China now learned from Filipino teachers. He didn't try to sound American. He didn't erase his cadence. He spoke as himself. And then it happened. When he finished, the room did not just applaud. It stood. Delegates rose to their feet, clapping, some even cheering. A professor from Finland approached him afterward and said, "We have studied communication styles across Asia, and yours is the most effective. Your voice carried not just clarity, but humanity." Miguel nearly wept. For decades, he had carried the weight of a single insult. And now, standing in the heart of Europe, that weight lifted. The very sound once mocked as inferior was being praised as superior. At that moment, Filipino English was no longer just a skill. It had become a symbol, a gift, proof that the Philippines had transformed something inherited through history into something the world needed. Back home, the recognition spread. News stories highlighted Filipino teachers leading online classrooms as far away as Brazil and Russia. The Department of Education launched initiatives to brand the Philippines as a global hub for English learning. Even international airlines praised Filipino staff for their ability to calm anxious passengers with gentle, clear English. But the stories that touched Miguel most weren't the headlines. They were the personal ones. One night, after returning from Geneva, he opened his email. A message from a mother in Tokyo. "My daughter was shy and afraid to speak, but her Filipino teacher helped her believe in herself. Now she speaks with confidence and joy." Another message came from a student. "Sir, I used to feel embarrassed about my English. But today, I realized it's not a weakness. It is my gift. Thank you." Miguel leaned back in his chair, eyes blurred with tears. Those words meant more than any award, because it meant the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to the next generation. The irony was striking. Once upon a time, Filipino English was dismissed, corrected, mocked. But now, from Tokyo to Dubai, from Seoul to London, it had become indispensable, a trusted bridge between cultures. It was no longer unnatural. It was unstoppable. And so, the story doesn't end with Miguel. It ends with all of us. With every Filipino who has ever doubted their worth. With every parent who has told their child to be proud of their voice. With every worker abroad who has comforted a stranger in a language once borrowed, but now truly their own. As the sun set over Manila Bay, painting the sky in orange and purple, Miguel whispered the words he once wrote in his notebook. "Our voice is enough." And in that moment, he knew it wasn't just enough. It was the standard by which the world now measured clarity, connection, and humanity. So I ask you, watching this story unfold, what is the voice you carry that you've been told is not good enough? Could it be that the very thing you doubt is the gift the world is waiting for? Because if the story of Filipino English teaches us anything, it's this. Never underestimate the power of a voice born in humility, shaped by struggle, and carried with love. It can change not just conversations, but the course of history. And today, the world finally knows what was once mocked has now become the voice that Asia cannot live without. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Share it with your friends and family, because the world needs to hear what was once dismissed, now celebrated. And if you believe the Filipino spirit deserves to be heard, join us. Let's keep raising the voice of the Philippines until it echoes across the world.